Peter Coleman. I'm on faculty here at Teachers College, and I'm the director of the International Center for Cooperation and Conflict Resolution here. And I'm your sort of MC for tonight. But first I want to introduce the president of Teachers College, Susan Furman, who's going to welcome everyone. Let me just say in opening that Susan Furman has been our president now for 6 years. She's the first woman president of Teachers College. She's also president of the National Academy of Education, but started her career as a public school teacher in a while ago, and was a prep school teacher and a high school teacher in New York City, right? And then for 11 years she was the dean at UPenn Graduate School, where she was very active in broadening the involvement of the school in underserved communities in West Philadelphia. And she's been here since 2006, where she's done very impressive things at the college, and her work is especially felt off campus, where she's been working to bridge gaps in the city's underserved schools, implementing professional development programs in public schools in Harlem. Her passion for raising the performance of public schools to help all children, together with her knowledge of government, policy, and the classroom itself, makes her an outstanding social justice advocate at Teachers College. So please welcome Susan Furman.
Such a nice introduction. I'm reminded of when I was once on a panel with Governor Jim Hunt of North Carolina, and he liked the introduction so much, and he said he wished his wife and mother had been in the audience, because his wife would have appreciated it and his mother would have believed it. So anyway, this is just a wonderful evening. We always like to come to the Morton Deutsch Award ceremony because, first of all, it gives us a great chance to honor Morton Deutsch, who is our beloved and iconic star, our Professor Emeritus. History credits Morton as an eminent social psychologist, a pioneering scholar in social justice and group dynamics, and the premier architect of a field that's touched everyone's life in some way and saved literally millions of lives, modern conflict resolution. Anyone who has ever applied Mort's teaching toward mediating disputes, averting confrontations, or negotiating peace agreements can attest to the enduring power of his work. Today, under the gifted direction of Professor Peter Coleman, the International Center for Cooperation and Conflict Resolution, which Mort founded more than a quarter of a century ago, is, like Mort himself, going strong. So happy to see you here. Happy to honor tonight's honoree, who is an accomplished political scientist who has illuminated the exercise dynamics and limits of political power. So Dr. Gene Sharp is a hero to us, but to despots, he's a dangerous man. He's the man behind the nonviolent freedom fighters manuals that not only have inspired millions to topple one dictatorship after another in Eastern Europe and the former Soviet republics, and last spring across Northern Africa, but are also emboldening dissidents to keep waging a nonviolent struggle in countries such as Zimbabwe. Figuratively speaking, Gene Sharp is the Tom Joad of democratic resistance movements. Wherever activists are organizing peacefully to fight repressive regimes, Gene Sharp is there through his writings, which invariably become weapons of mass destruction. Instructions. Thanks. No wonder his books have been translated into more than 60 languages. I'm thrilled that we have the opportunity to honor this very dangerous man, who is also a hero to us and to millions, and is a noble exemplar of social justice, as noble a one as anyone can find. So thank you and welcome.
The idea for this has a long history. I'm going to make it short. I mean, Mort Deutsch has been concerned with social justice since he was a young boy, and his friends, or the older boys, wouldn't let him play softball. Later, he, as a busboy in the Catskills, organized the busboys to strike. So he's been making trouble for a long time, and became a scholar of social justice at some point in his career, and published many important articles and books on the subject. But the impetus for this particular event, I don't know if you remember this, really came out of About 2004, Mort came into the center and said, there's a problem that we really have to put some intellectual energy into that I feel is insufficiently addressed these days, and it is the increasing gap between the haves and the have-nots. And I think we should really actively think about that issue, what's happening, how do we understand it, and how could it be interrupted. So we convened a faculty group for a year and a half or so where we read about the issue, and we found that there was a lot of very important information of how to describe the dynamics of oppression, the dynamics of control, of the dominance of the oppressed. But there wasn't a lot out there about strategies for interruption, strategies to change. So we decided to, at that time, hold a conference called Interrupting Oppression and Sustaining Justice, where we brought together advocates and scholars and graduate students who were interested in that area, and had a 2-day session which resulted in a special issue of Social Justice. But we wanted to institutionalize the identification and celebration and to incentivize work on social justice. So that's where the idea for this event came, is that we wanted to annually award and recognize a student within Columbia University that was doing important scholarship in this area, and we wanted to really celebrate and recognize a distinguished scholar practitioner, which is why we're here tonight, right? I wanted to give you a quick sense of the previous recipients, which are right here. First recipient was Michelle Fine, Mazarine Banaji, Jeffrey Canada, John Jost, Janusz Zelak and Janusz Rakowski, who were two individuals involved in the solidarity negotiations in Poland, Sister Elaine Roulet, Claude Steele, and last year Irvin Staub. A notable group, as well as an impressive group of graduate student paper award recipients who at some point I'm sure will be our distinguished scholars. So that's the context and the history.
It's my pleasure to introduce the winner of the Distinguished Graduate Student paper on social justice. As has been mentioned, the award ceremony is meant to stimulate and recognize innovation in the scholarship and practice in the area of social justice. And we put out a call for papers long about January, and we welcome them from all disciplines. And what we look for are a variety of things, including a clear conceptual framework, sound analysis, innovative thinking, and recommendations for remedying the conditions that are impacted by social inequities. So we're looking both for scholarship and suggestions about how to make the scholarship practical. This year the review panel included Kareem Aleph from the International and Comparative Education Department, Alex Carter from Columbia Law School, Beth Fisher-Yoshida from the Negotiation and Conflict Resolution Program at Columbia School of General Studies, and moi. And I now have the honor of telling you a little bit about our winner, Kate Cronin-Furman, and you'll be hearing her speak in just a moment. Kate is 2006 graduate of our own Columbia Law School, where she was a notes editor on the Columbia Law Review. Following law school, she spent several months volunteering at Legal Aid of Cambodia in Phnom Penh before returning to New York to join a law firm, that of Hughes, Hubbard & Reed, LLP, as a litigation associate. She also served as a law clerk, subsequently on the International Court of Justice. She's currently back pursuing a PhD in political science at Columbia, and she's writing a dissertation on accountability after mass atrocity. She also blogs about international law and human rights and at www.wrongingrights.com. So it's my pleasure now to introduce Kate. She'll be speaking about managing expectations, international criminal trials, and the prospects for deterrence of mass atrocity.
This project was motivated by something I heard frequently when I worked in international criminal law. And that's the idea that prosecutions for genocide, for war crimes, and for crimes against humanity can produce deterrence and thereby prevent future mass atrocities. Now, there's no hard evidence that this is true, but that's largely because this is a phenomenon that's really difficult to study empirically, and honestly, we haven't had a lot of these trials. So in my paper, I'm less concerned with proving or disproving this claim on the evidence, and more with teasing out and assessing the logic that underlies it. So I set out to analyze whether it's reasonable to expect international criminal trials to lead to the reduction of mass atrocity. A couple of quick definitions. First, what I'm talking about when I refer to the international criminal justice system is the set of institutions established by the international community to try persons accused of mass atrocity. The most prominent example of this is the International Criminal Court, but I'm also including the ad hoc international criminal tribunals for Rwanda and Yugoslavia, as well as the hybrid tribunals currently operating in Cambodia and Sierra Leone. And when I say deterrence, I'm referring actually to the concept of general rather than specific deterrence. And that's the idea that by punishing criminals, you can deter other potential violators. So the logic there is that if a criminal justice system can set the costs of crime sufficiently high, potential criminals will rationally choose not to offend. So interestingly, although the question of deterrence is a really old concept in debates about domestic criminal justice, it's a relatively recent addition to the discourse on international criminal law. Modern international criminal law was born at the Nuremberg Tribunal, and there was a strong focus on retribution, on punishing the guilty. And that remained the core goal of the establishment of the international criminal tribunals for Yugoslavia and Rwanda in the 90s. We only really started hearing about deterrence in international criminal law with the creation of the ICC, which was founded in 2002. So this is a pretty new discussion for international criminal lawyers, and it hasn't advanced very far. In fact, it's kind of still hung up on the rational actor assumption. So the rational actor assumption is important because for deterrence to operate in any system, we have to assume that potential perpetrators are making rational cost-benefit calculations. Many international lawyers, however, argue that the commission of mass atrocity defies logic, and that therefore the perpetrators must be operating without rationality and that they can't be deterred. So the picture there of LRA leader Joseph Kony, who's been in the news a lot lately, and he's a really frequently cited example of an irrational perpetrator. He believes that he channels God, and he, has a rather incoherent political platform, so he's often brought up in this debate. But Kony notwithstanding, social science accounts of the commission of mass atrocities suggest that generally this type of violence is the result of rational strategic decisions. So if that's the case, and potential perpetrators are not categorically undeterrable by reason of irrationality, then we actually need to move this debate forward a little bit. So what I'm suggesting is that we need to ask how we should expect the prospect of international criminal trials to affect the decisions of presumptively rational perpetrators, potential perpetrators. So in my paper, I argue that in order to perform this analysis, we need to take account of two things. The first is how deterrence actually works, and what conditions need to exist in order for a potential perpetrator to be deterred. The second is what we understand about the commission of mass atrocity and what we know about the incentive structures of those perpetrators. So I look at these two factors in order to determine if and when we should expect the threat of international criminal prosecution to actually deter a potential perpetrator of mass atrocity. So deterrence theory tells us that three conditions have to be met in order for an increased risk of prosecution and punishment to produce a marginal deterrent effect. First, a potential perpetrator would have to believe that the change realistically affects his or her chances of punishment. So if, for instance, New York implements a policy of increasing prosecution for marijuana possession, but they only actually arrest and try residents of low-income areas of the city, I'm thinking recreational drug users on the Upper East Side are not too likely to be deterred by that change in policy. So that would fail on the first criterion. The second condition is that potential perpetrators can't be subject to other, stronger deterrent influences, and here it could be either formal or informal sanctioning procedures. So an example of that is if a government enacts a law criminalizing coup attempts. If the standard outcome of a failed coup attempt is that you get taken out back and shot, then the prospect of jail time presented by the new statute is not really likely to have a deterrent effect either. Finally, the third condition is that the potential perpetrator can't have what we call an overriding interest in offending. So the criminological literature usually mentions addiction in this context because of the benefits that addicts derive from drug use. However, this can also apply to the avoidance of a significant harm. For instance, the person who steals food because he is starving has an overriding interest in offending. So when we start to apply these criteria to the international context, one thing we see pretty immediately is that because the ICC is the only court with prospective rather than retroactive jurisdiction, it's the only institution that could reasonably produce deterrence. So henceforth, my analysis is limited to discussion of the ICC. However, I argue that it's actually the court's prosecutorial policy that determines how any given particular potential offender perceives his or her chances of ending up on trial. So far, all of the ICC indictees have been Africans. The majority have been rebel commanders. So we might expect that a regime leader in a Central Asian republic would not perceive his chances of punishment to be materially increased by the operation of the ICC. So to look at the presence of pre-existing deterrent influences and overriding interest in offending, I turned to the social science literature investigating large-scale violence against civilians during war, and I analyzed the likely incentive structure of these perpetrators. So what I find is that most accounts of this type of violence suggest that mass atrocity is a strategy of last resort. This suggests that these perpetrators do probably have an overriding interest in offending, and it's the avoidance of military defeat or the loss of territory. Additionally, the risk of retaliation from the other side in an armed conflict probably represents a strong pre-existing deterrent influence against offending. So that's not looking great for our deterrent effect right now. However, what I've just said doesn't necessarily capture the entire universe of cases in which atrocity crimes are committed. The literature also suggests that atrocities may occur not only as this strategic command-level decision of last resort, but also through the failure of commanders to restrain the criminal impulses of their subordinates. So I think we can clearly distinguish these more negligent commanders from those who affirmatively order the strategic commission of mass atrocity. And I think this distinction is extremely important for the prospects for deterrence. Commanders who permit rather than ordering violence against civilians may be less likely to have the sort of highly uneven cost-benefit calculations that make deterrence unlikely in the other case. They're not making an affirmative choice to order atrocities, so they're not likely to perceive overriding benefits from their commission. Additionally, if their legal system or their military culture doesn't penalize commanders for negligence regarding the actions of their subordinates, they're probably not facing pre-existing deterrent influences either. So based on this idea that we have these two broad types of potential perpetrators and that commanders who permit mass atrocity rather than ordering it are a much likelier case for the operation of deterrence, I go back to that first factor for deterrence, the likelihood of actually facing prosecution and punishment. And I ask how the ICC's current prosecutorial policy is likely to impact potential perpetrators in this second negligent group's perception of their risk of punishment. So what I find is actually pretty surprising, given the rhetoric that deterrence was a primary aim of the ICC's founding. Of the 19 arrest warrants publicly issued by the court through the end of 2011, only one is for this second negligent type of commander. And that's Congolese rebel leader Jean-Pierre Bemba, who's shown here at trial at the ICC. Bemba is charged under the doctrine of command responsibility in connection with widespread rape and looting in the Central African Republic. The allegation is not that he ordered his men to commit these atrocities, but rather that he knew about it, he could have prevented it, and he failed to do so. So what I conclude from this analysis of the ICC warrants is that the current policy pursued by the ICC prosecutor's office is unlikely to maximize the prospects for deterrence of mass atrocity. I suspect this may be attributable to the fact that while command responsibility cases like Bemba's may be the best case scenario for actually producing deterrence, they're not as viscerally appealing as prosecuting the architects of atrocity type offenders. And this suggests that despite the rhetoric surrounding the importance of the court's deterrent function, actually prosecutorial choices may be grounded in expressivist goals, like signaling the international community's abhorrence of this type of crime and its unwillingness to tolerate it. So interestingly, although a lot of the literature actually treats expressive goals and deterrent goals as if they were interchangeable concepts, my analysis above suggests that they may not be fully compatible goals. And in fact, those cases most likely to have a strong expressive impact, for instance, the arrest warrant for President Omar al-Bashir, shown here with a really awesome hat. He is a sitting head of state. Those cases that are most likely to have a strong expressive impact are those that are actually least likely to have a true deterrent effect. Thank you.
This notion of an award is not just talk. So there is a $500 check that will be handed today. And we also have a shiny object. And this one is beautifully packed. This one has velvet. And, yeah, wow, this is nicer than last year. But it's a globe, and her name is engraved on it. So hopefully that will be a good one.
So now it is my honor and pleasure to introduce Professor Gene Sharp. Just a little history. Professor Sharp received his BA in Social Sciences in 1949 from Ohio State, a Master's of Arts in Sociology in 1951 from Ohio State as well, and then his PhD in Political Theory in the Summer of Love, 1968, from St. Catherine's College, Oxford, England. He is Professor Emeritus of Political Science at the University of Massachusetts, Dartmouth, and has had research appointments at Harvard University's Center for International Affairs since 1965. In 1983, he founded the Albert Einstein Institution, which is a nonprofit organization devoted to studies and promotion of the use of nonviolent action in conflicts worldwide. So some of the projects that the Albert Einstein Institution has been involved in include jungle workshops with Burmese pro-democracy groups, intensive 10-day courses with Tibetan leaders and activists, a book-length Tibetan translation with a foreword by His Holiness the Dalai Lama, anti-coup consultations in Thailand, civilian-based defense presentations in the Baltic states, and the development of materials on strategic planning. His many extensive and high-impact contributions to the field of social justice include The Politics of Nonviolent Action, published in 1973, his book Gandhi as a Political Strategist, published in 1979, Social Power and Political Freedom in 1980, Making Europe Unconquerable, 1985, Civilian-Based Defense, 1990, from his most famous book, perhaps, From Dictatorship to Democracy, which was published in 93, 2002, and 2003, which proposes 198 methods of nonviolent resistance. And his most recent book is Waging Nonviolent Struggle, 20th Century Practice and 21st Century Potential, that builds on his 50 years of definitive academic research and practical experience aiding nonviolent struggles. It documents 23 significant and often successful struggles in a range of cultural and political contexts, and reaffirms nonviolent action as a realistic and powerful alternative to both passivity and violence. His works have not only provided an empirical record of civic resistance of all types, but it really presents a basic theory of political power, drawing on several sources such as Gandhi and Arendt, the anarchist. His central message is that the power of dictatorships comes from the willing obedience of the people they govern, and that if the people can develop techniques of withholding their consent, that a regime will crumble. As he has said, as soon as you choose to fight with violence, you're choosing to fight against your opponent's best weapons, and you have to be smarter than that. He's also really advocated nonviolence as an effective strategy beyond simply a moral appeal. His work, as President Furman had alluded to, has had extraordinary impact on the ground recently, but actually for years now. During the demonstrations in Egypt, during the so-called Arab Spring, it was reported that protesters had been given photocopies of a handout containing a list of Dr. Sharp's 198 methods. a protester reported to be unaware of their origins. He proudly described how many of them had been used in Egypt, even though he had never heard of Dr. Sharp. Another organizer said one of the main points which we used was Sharp's idea of identifying a regime's pillars of support. He said if we could build a relationship with the army, Mubarak's biggest pillar of support, to get them on our side, then we knew he would quickly be finished. He also was involved in Serbia and the Ukraine, as Milosevic in Serbia and Yanukovych in the Ukraine fell to the color revolutions that swept across Eastern Europe. Each of the democratic movements paid tribute to Dr. Sharp's contributions. The Serbs who used his books as a theoretical base for activities founded their own organization called the Center for Applied Nonviolence, and alongside their own materials have carried out workshops using Dr. Sharp's work. In Iran, as you perhaps recall, during the Green Uprising in 2009, many of the protesters were later accused at their trials of using more than 100 of Dr. Sharp's 198 methods. His most translated and distributed work, Dictatorship to Democracy, was written for the Burmese democratic movement in 1993 after the imprisonment of Aung San Suu Kyi, who, as we know, won a seat in parliament this week. From Burma, word of mouth spread through Thailand to Indonesia, where this work was used against the military dictatorship there. And then finally, there's a tremendous documentary called How to Start a Revolution that I would encourage you to view if you haven't. And in that, Sharp says that the success of the film rests not on his shoulders, but on the bravery of ordinary people who, for the past 12 months alone, have faced down dictators in Tunisia and Egypt. But he warns, and perhaps he'll speak to this, that inspiration alone is not enough, that the most important thing in a revolution is to be prepared. And nonviolent struggle is more complex than the brute strength of military power. And I quote him, "Before you try anything, learn what the struggle is about, why it fails, why it works, why it succeeds. Some revolutionaries think they know everything. They need to know that they do not. And if you want to stage a successful revolution, you have to be willing to learn." So, with that as context, I ask you to provide a warm welcome to the 2012 recipient of the Morton Deutsch Distinguished Scholarship in Social Justice Award, Dr. Jean-Pierre.
Thank you all very much. It's an honor to be here, and particularly under the auspices of Morton Deutsch's lectureship here. If my memory is correct, when I was in Oxford in the early 60s, I was having a period of rather bad morale and difficulties. And if I remember right, we exchanged correspondence which really helped give me confidence I could go on and do this work, which takes a very, very long time and is very difficult. So I'm very honored to be here under his auspices. There's someone you might know, his name, Kenneth Boulding. He's an economist, important advocate of peace, and with his wife also. And at one point he created, supposedly, what he called Boulding's first law. Frankly, I think he didn't create it. I think he stole it from the Greeks somewhere, way back, a few 100 years ago, many hundred years ago. That which is possible. And that passes right over people's heads for the most part. But it means if something has actually happened, why the hell all these explanations why it's impossible? If it's actually happened, I've tried to base my work as much as possible on historical cases and insights from historical cases that actually occurred. And I know now, since about a year and a quarter ago, that argument that this is impossible you don't hear that very much anymore. There's been a major breakthrough because it's we now know that it is possible to resist tyrants. We're even knowing that the Nazis were sometimes resisted and sometimes defeated by these means. We're knowing that this is sometimes also given credit for things it didn't do. I've given credit for a lot of the Eastern European revolutions, including Poland. I had nothing to do with Poland. And there were Russian correspondents here a couple days this week who couldn't ask me, was it you or was it Gorbachev that brought down the Soviet Union? And I claimed with the one who was maybe Karl Deutsch, his Cracks in the Monolith essay of 1957, who gave the realization that even totalitarian systems have weaknesses. And if people can learn where those weaknesses are and can see where nonviolent struggle has the capacity of hitting in on those weaknesses, you have a chance of succeeding. And then even without some of that effort, then the Soviet Union, with all of its inherent problems and all of its great strength in other ways also, disintegrated. Something that the Pentagon didn't do. All those billions of dollars to defeat the Soviet Union, and it didn't use any of it. Something new has happened now. Since last February and March and April, we've been going at this for a long time. And Jamila Rakib, who's here, had been working with me for 10 years, and tremendous help. But she's seen how things have changed. Because now we see that it is happening. And it's happening without a... Yeah.
There we go. Try that.
There's no Messiah, no Mahatma, no great charismatic leader. In many of these cases, there's nothing new. In some of the Russian revolutions of 1905 and in February 1917, where would you find the leaders? Hard to identify. But we've had the belief that you have to be a Mahatma. And we all know we're not good enough to be a Mahatma or even an ordinary Christian saint, you know. But we thought, well, therefore it's impossible. This happens anyhow. We can therefore learn, how does it happen? Not so much why, I haven't really gone into that, but what are the factors that contribute to success, and what are the factors that contribute to failure? Robert Helby, a military friend of mine, who's a really authority in the subject of nonviolent struggle, also calls them contaminants, things that really mess up the application of nonviolent struggle, among which are violence. And still a lot of people think, well, to use nonviolence, in a pinch you have to be ready to use some violence. That's nonsense. That is the factor that is helping to defeat the revolution in Syria, when some of the army soldiers then turn their guns on their former colleagues. Those former colleagues aren't going to walk out of the army. They're going to shoot back and give the regime the strongest capacity for power it has today. And we know it's been used in a variety of purposes. We all heard of the civil rights movement, or some of you might have been in it. You know, we know it was used during anti-colonial struggles. India's famous, but there are others in Ghana, for example, and others in as well. But then we learn, how can we apply it for new situations against more extreme dictatorships? We know it was used against the Nazis and helped defeat the quisling fascist regime in Norway during the Nazi occupation. But could it have really could it bring down in the future a real Nazi regime, and not just its subservient applications? How could it be applied in dealing with terrorism? These are all issues not for belief. And that's when I've taken this away from the the true believers, and some of them don't like it. It used to be said, and I used to believe it, that you had to believe in nonviolent struggle in order to use it effectively. We now know that's nonsense. And some of the bravest people and most effective people haven't believed in moral nonviolence at all. I was very threatened by this discovery. I was in the basement of the Harvard State University library looking at old newspapers. And I don't remember at the moment whether they're Indian newspapers or newspapers from London. And there was this count of this one of the major struggles. I think it was the 1931 campaign. And suddenly, from what was there, it was clear that the people so bravely struggling in that struggle and so disciplined nonviolently didn't believe in ahimsa, didn't believe in an ethic of nonviolence. And I was shocked. I said, oh dear, do I write this down? Do I report it? Because I believe it was a great threat to what I was believing. And I said, well, okay, I'll write it down. And then it dawned on me, this is not just a threat. This is a great opportunity. Because now it means that you don't have to wait decades or centuries or eons for everybody to be converted to moral nonviolence before you get rid of war or other violence. Ordinary people can do it without believing, but do what is needed. And that's what we've been seeing through much of the world, and what now is obvious to many people. So the issue almost never arises anymore, except maybe if you're in a particular group that believes that way. So we've been trying to do this for a long time. I began my first studies in this field back about 1949. And I had to change and sometimes reverse some of the opinions that weren't based on reality and see new ways of looking at this. And I found that it used to be thought, for example, that Muslims wouldn't be able to do this. They're all for violence. We now know that's utter nonsense. The struggles in the North Frontier province of British India, of Khan of Ghaffar Khan, very brave, predominantly Muslim nonviolent struggle movement that Gandhi said was stronger and more disciplined than that in Hindu India, Muslim-led and Muslim practice. With this From Dictatorship to Democracy, it was published even in pamphlet form in Thailand. I thought it was not going to spread much more than some of the different parts of Burma, because Burma has many languages. We've got it translated into 4 in addition to Burmese, and there were others. But it was seen in a bookstore window by a student from Jakarta. He bought a copy, and it was in English. It was finished in Burmese and English, but it was in English also. He took it back to Jakarta and got it to a publisher. And it was published with an introduction by Abdurrahman Wahid, the head of the largest Muslim organization in the world, and later president of Indonesia. And we've seen the more recent struggles in the Arab countries. Many other preconceptions. There are preconceptions. I used to get strong arguments. People said, you shouldn't be planning this. It has to be spontaneous. And now that's garbage. Spontaneity has its place sometimes. Sometimes it can mess things up. But people who are not spontaneous but are planning skillfully nonviolent struggle, how to do it and what not to do, can use this nonviolent struggle, and we can learn how to do it. But we've had people contacting us for many years, and they would come to us and say, what should we do in my country? And I said, I don't know. And if I did think I knew, I shouldn't tell you, because it would probably be wrong. It would mess you up. But you can learn how to plan a strategy for your country. We therefore have a new guide that Jamila helped me prepare. Over several years we had people coming, some of them from Syria and other places. And I concluded, after reflecting back on those times in extensive correspondence, long letters, both with others, that you need to know 3 things before you can plan your own strategy. You need to know your own situation in depth, not what you think you know, because you probably don't know half of what's true in your own situation. But you need to know it and find out, including what are the weaknesses of your opponents. You need to understand and know in depth what is nonviolent struggle and what makes it succeed and what makes it fail. And if you think, lots of people who are trainers and believers in nonviolence or think they know it already. Let you in a secret, they don't. It's much more complicated than that, as our previous speakers mentioned. And then that's on the beginning, that gets you up to the point where you can begin to think, how does this situation we're facing with all the strengths of the opponent, with all the weaknesses of the opponent, and what we are learning now about nonviolent struggle does not depend on melting the heart, contrary to one of Milton Mayer's essays years and years ago on melting the heart of Hitler. It's nonsense. But how can you bring down that kind of a regime? That's the moral issue. Not how can you love Hitler, which his essay in the Progressive spoke about. How can you really destroy a dictatorship? And thinking, then, can you think strategically? Many people don't. They think it's good enough, it's all we can do, it's just to show how evil that regime is. All the terrible things it's done, and what it's capable of doing today. And if you witness against it, witnessing used to be a very important word among the peace groups. They want to witness against the evil of war and everything. But so what? So they're not telling people anything new. We know that war is not loving and kissing, But you get to learn how to think, how to plan, to act skillfully. To take step 1, if that's a wise step. It might be a stupid step, but to take a wise step, and then you know the opponent probably isn't going to love you for that. That's why people get killed in nonviolent struggles. Not just beaten, but slaughtered. And if you think everybody's going to love you if you're going to be nonviolent, or there's something wrong if they don't, you've got a lot to learn, Now, we know that this can be helpful in struggles. We know we have guides now on basic principles of conducting this for national defense. Not national retaliation, but defense against if you're actually invaded and occupied, or the coup d'etat, a seizure of the state to impose a new dictatorship. We have a guidebook on that called the Anti-Coup. How to prevent a coup d'etat, which is a major way dictatorships come into existence, and how to defeat it if there is an attempt at a coup d'etat. But that isn't what everybody likes. We've had visitors who really are very upset at the collapse of the Soviet Union, and therefore I was told my name is very well known in Russia, and not very well liked. because they give me credit for something I could never do and didn't do, of helping to bring down the Soviet Union. I didn't. I just published my little work from my studies in my small office, in a crowded office. They think we must have been financed by the CIA. We had one group of Russians came to us about 3 years or so ago, an entourage of 12 of them all at once. We couldn't get them into our tiny office, really. Some of them had to be waiting in the hall part of the time. And they had been expecting a big office suite and a large staff. And they came in, and at that time it was only Jamila and I were the only ones there, in 2 very crowded offices with lots of boxes, because I had no place and no staff to help me unpack the office from the last time we had to move out from several places. We had to move a lot. That's not very helpful to any of you who do studies in writing. And so we learned that is not nonviolent struggle that depends on all that kind of thing. You can learn this is one book of new books. Here's the newest from mine. It's Sharp. It's not my idea to call it Sharp's Dictionary. But it's called Sharp's Dictionary of Power and Struggle. Almost how many? 1,000? Almost 1,000 entries. And only about 850 or so are actually defined entries. And there are other referred to other entries. The thinking has been difficult in this field because our concepts have been fuzzy at best. We use the term nonviolence to mean 5 or 6 different things, sometimes the opposite of each other, and think we're being smart and clever. We have to think as rigorously as in any field of scholarship or science that you can imagine. Or sports, they have names for different moves, We must be equally clear in our thinking and understanding of the field of peace and the field of conflict. Because conflict is very important. I used to run into arguments, maybe I still do sometimes, with people who think conflict is really a bad thing. I spoke one time with a group, and one shocked poor lady in the audience afterwards, in great dismay, got up and she said, "Well, you're not doing anything important. All you're doing is taking the violence out of war." And she did not guess that might not be a bad thing to do. But this is very different. There's kinds of beautiful moral religious pacifism. I'm not detracting anything from those who believe that way. But what about the rest of us? You see, people sometimes are very awkward when they say, "Well, you mean these people who don't believe in religious nonviolence? There's something wrong there. Could they?" I said, "What do you believe? If they're not going to believe like you do, you want them to use violence?" Because I thought you can't really use nonviolence, so if you don't believe right. You want them to use violence? Well, not very comfortable about that. But what we're trying to say is that in the past 15 months or so, there has been a breakthrough. I was predicting this for decades. Some people would come in to work in this field, and the years went by, and they didn't get a big job, and so forth. And they began to think, "Well, this talking about a breakthrough, where is that?" And so I said, "Well, it hasn't got here yet." you know. But the breakthrough has come after Tunisia and after Egypt. And the other spreading thing that people then remembered, there was Eastern Europe, there was East Germany, there was Czechoslovakia. There was the three little nations that had not just been occupied by, but incorporated into the Soviet Union, got out by nonviolent struggle, drawing partly on their own tuition and sense, because those were little countries that had major guerrilla struggles against the Russian Empire, against the Nazi occupation, against the Soviet Union. And they decided not to do that again. So on their own, they started using nonviolent struggle, and they formed singing, great choirs of people singing. There's a film called The Singing Revolution. If you ever get a chance to see it, it's beautiful. And they formed, I didn't have any idea, but Lithuania's in the south. Its capital is Vilnius. Riga is the one in the middle. That's Riga. And Estonia, Tallinn, the capital, in the north. It's quite a long way, even if you're driving a car. They formed a human chain from Vilnius in the south to Tallinn in the north. How many thousand people that would be. And those people chose to be nonviolent. And we were invited to come there. We gave a copy of the book Civilian-Based Defense, published by Princeton University Press in, was it 92 or 3? And so we met by invitation with the elected, but independence-minded governments. The Russian troops, the Soviet troops were still there, the KGB was still there, and the local communists were still there. But those people organized, and they got out of the Soviet Union, not like Chechnya. So few deaths, you'd be shocked, but they got their real independence, and one of those leaders, Albert Einstein, later on negotiated to get them to actually get the troops out after they recognized their independence. In the south, at Vilnius, I think 13, possibly 14, I don't always get it right, people were shot at a demonstration at the television tower. I've been to the cemetery where they lie. I've talked to people who were there. I know it happened. When we had Russians come to say, that wasn't Russians who did it. That was other Lithuanians. Yeah. In Latvia, I think it was 8 we shot. Some of them in the public square from the building where some of the communist offices were. In the north, in Estonia, nobody was killed. They used the planning that we had sketched. They had to have trouble keeping discipline because, particularly in Lithuania, the young guys who had their hunting rifles, they had such little weapons. In the Parliament building, they had netting, fish netting, over certain areas where people would come down that hallway into here, and they would pull a string, and the netting all fixed up with fishing hooks would be there to capture the soldiers if they got into the building. That's how primitive the military capacity was. But they were brave, and they'd win, and they used nonviolent means deliberately by their governments, and they got out their independence and their freedom. That doesn't mean it would have happened perfectly under some other conditions. It doesn't mean it could have been done somewhere else easily. This struggle is usually not easy. But you have to be smart to do it. Be smarter than your opponents. Don't do the thing they want you to do. And they always want you to use violence because they know they can crush that. Now this breakthrough has come, and there's room in this field for major research. All kinds of research. Over the years, drafted at least 3 different drafts of research areas for this. I don't know where any of those drafts are anymore, but they're there. And other people can figure out this field. This kind of research needs to be done. And needs people with brains like you. It needs people who can present this rationally to the public, not as to believe, but to think about it. To think. The Russians were there to see us twice this last week, and one lady who was very upset about what happened to the Soviet Union. And she said, well, what message did I have for the Russian revolutionaries? And I said, stop. Think, study, and think. And that applies to all of us, whatever our proposed solution or panacea is, or favorite solution, or something else you prefer to do. It's good to meet you all. I'm very honored to be here at this particular occasion. Martin, thank you very much.